Friday night. Oh, we made it before six
What?
o'clock.
I don't know. My clock just turned 6.
Now, there we go. We made it right on time. All right, that is like clockwork.
Yeah, so that's pretty impressive. You can tell it's getting dark. It's dark earlier, and it
Uh,
makes us so much easier to be on our schedule. We're done doing anything outdoors for the day.
yeah.
So yeah, I've
Well,
noticed that during the winter we're a lot better with our timing.
I know in winter, what is it, 51 degrees right now by my calculator. So I hope my little space heater isn't making too much noise because
Oh,
that's cold.
yeah, I can't hear it. No, it's good. It's good. So yeah, we were lamenting off air how this January has been really kind of cold and gloomy in
Yeah.
Las Vegas and very unusual. But yeah, maybe good for podcasting.
Yeah, no, totally. Inside and just doing some indoor riding and trying to, the one thing I love riding outdoors. I don't mind riding too much in the cold, but it's the prep to get ready.
Yep.
It's all the layers you got to put on and so forth. So so I end
I've
up
got
jumping on the
every piece
trainer.
of winter riding gear you could possibly need, but then I've got my bike right like 2 meters from me here,
Yeah.
and I can just jump on. And I wish we did have a calculation that we could look at, like bang for your buck,
Uh-huh.
a 2 hour indoor ride versus a 3 hour
Yeah.
outdoor ride.
Yeah. Right.
I can tell you, like personally for me, like 2 hours or even 3 hours indoors seems significantly harder, not
Yeah.
just mentally but physically,
Mhm.
than outdoor riding. What do you think?
Yeah, well, you're not getting any coasting time. You
Yep.
are pedaling the entire time. And so actually it's very similar to when we talk about running in the water and which, we talked about right before we started here. And running in water is very much the same in that it's a continuous movement. You're getting resistance no matter what direction you're moving. And so no, I look at an hour ride on the trainer as easily equivalent to an hour and a half, something
Yep.
along that line outside. But
Yep.
riding inside is still that's not easy. Even doing an hour, doing 2 hours, that's not easy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, when I'm outdoors, I'm on a different computer setup,
Hmm.
and one of my screens on my Garmin computer tells me how many kilojoules I
Yeah.
use. But I don't do that indoors. I should
Mm.
look at it indoors. I bet it's
Yeah.
significantly more kilojoules when you really start to talk about, if I'm 2 hours versus 2 hours.
Hmm.
You're right. There is very little coasting.
Well, we
Outdoors.
did do some work on this,
Okay.
and I had a student do his thesis on using a stationary cycling and riding outside, and we actually did it down in the Thomas and Mack parking lot, and we looked actually at muscle activity,
Right. Yeah.
and oddly enough, or not oddly enough, muscle activity was not different indoors or outdoors. But this is a study I want to go back and do again. I think it's there's some merit to looking at this indoor outdoor, especially now that there's this creation of the rocker board for
Yeah.
the indoor trainer, give it a little bit more feel for outside.
You know, I, I I think the muscle activity is the same, but like you were saying, it's the time of resting when you're outside,
Mhm.
right? You get a light, a car comes, whatever the case may
Yeah,
be. Very rarely are you 2 hours of just steady.
yeah, that's right.
It's
That's
one
right.
of the things that I really like about going up Mount Charleston is
Yeah,
it'll be 2 hours of no break,
right, right.
and it's a lot more of a concerted effort.
Hmm.
So even if the muscle activity is the same, I
Yeah.
think that yeah, just the pure number of pedal strokes in 2 hours would be
Hmm.
significantly higher. I'm gonna count it. I'm gonna figure this out.
There you go. Well, you know what? Another benefit of riding inside is you can watch our podcast.
Exactly. Instead of just listening to it, you can see us as well
That's right.
as
And we've got a few comments here already. Luigi says he's Zwifting until March. And
yep.
Bob says, yes, there's no coasting and you can't stop pedaling. And Chip says, hi guys, gonna have to watch another time. Okay, Chip, we'll catch you
We'll
later.
record it.
So
We'll record
yeah.
it. But March, that's getting pretty deep.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm itching to go outside. I was actually thinking today, I was like, oh man, I really want to increase my bike volume this spring.
Yeah.
And I was like, I got to get back to the commuting.
Hmm. Yeah,
You know,
right, right.
those mornings into work can be really chilly.
Yeah,
But I
right.
was like, I got the gear. I just got to do it.
I know, I know.
Because it's easy volume.
Yeah. No, when I was going to work, I loved commuting. I really enjoyed that. And it was a nice, ride to work. Like you said, you get bundled up, but a lot of times when you come home, it's actually quite nice and
Yeah.
you don't have to bundle up as much. So you just backpack it.
Yep.
But I'm working largely, from home still. So
Yeah, I go in, I'm going in 4 days a week,
yeah,
pretty regular, and some days 5 days a week. So I mean, I got to do it.
yeah.
It's when it's a nice day, it's easy.
Hmm.
Like March, April, May, those are easy.
Yeah,
January, February is a little bit harder.
yeah. Well, and riding inside, I mean, the other thing is, and this is, I'm making a segue to our topic tonight, is looking at heart rate. You can really monitor your heart rate nicely indoors. Outdoors, you can as well because you can broadcast your heart rate for a lot of cycling computers. But you're also outdoors, you're paying attention to a lot of different things.
And you should be,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
You shouldn't be staring at your computer all the time when you're outdoors. No, I agree. And one of the things you can do, especially on an indoor trainer, using erg mode in particular,
Hmm.
is you can dial yourself in. Like if I want to be at 130 heart rate, I can dial myself in on erg mode,
Yeah,
and it'll just hold.
yeah,
And yes,
yeah.
after an hour, maybe I'll get a little drifted, but it
Yep.
might go up to 131, 132. And
Hmm.
to me, the really interesting thing is if I change my position, I change my heart rate.
Yeah, right,
Right?
right.
Depending on if I'm seated up, if I'm an arrow, or if I'm halfway up, that actually has more of an effect.
Yeah.
You can get really sensitive when you're using the erg mode. I don't know. Have you ever
Mhm.
done that, John? Where you
I only
right?
use the ARG mode.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that. I like setting a consistent intensity for the
Yeah.
indoor training that I do. That's how I use that tool is
And are
to
you using it? Like I know you're using because I mean the erg mode is power, but are you using heart rate as one of the metrics to determine your
no, I'm
power?
just using erg mode only for power. And then I'll look at heart rate afterwards. I actually don't monitor heart rate too much during exercise.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
So I actually pay a lot of attention to heart rate when I exercise. I actually personally find it more important to me than power
Mm-hmm.
and when running than pace. And we've talked a little bit about this before
Yeah.
because I mean that is the true metric of what's going on in my body,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And that's the physiologic stress on my system. And there's a lot of inputs to why it's the heart rate is doing what it's doing. And sometimes those inputs are telling you a little tale if you
Yeah.
really pay attention to it. And I know you've done a ton of work in cardiac rehab and in heart rates study of people's heart rate. Um, I mean, so what do you think as far as power versus heart rate in general?
I think you got to use all the tools, like
Yeah,
like you talked about. There's different, and what we're really doing is using tools to monitor the intensity of exercise,
yeah,
and the tools really break down to measuring oxygen, which you need a 40, $50,000 piece of equipment, to get laboratory grade metabolic cart, where you breathe into a mask, into a snorkel, and that air goes into a computer, and you're measuring how much oxygen you're actually using during exercise. And that is really the gold standard of what we're working towards. And everything is sort of based on that. That's what we're trying to target is a certain VO2, rate of oxygen consumption. And so now you have other ways to monitor intensity because it's not practical to measure VO2 right now. And so we have heart rate, which we're talking about, which is obviously how fast your heart speed, and that's correlated with VO2. Then you have a psychological parameter like rating of perceived exertion or just how subjectively hard you feel the exercise is. And that actually is a very valid tool. And then you also have a mechanical parameter like power. And that is also very related to rate of oxygen consumption. So these are all tools to measure intensity of exercise. And the trick is not just relying on one, but really sort of using this bag of tools because one may be off for one reason or another for that day.
and it's a dance.
It is.
And
Yeah,
it's
I like that.
art
Yeah.
form. The one that you didn't mention was pace. So in
Hmm.
running and swimming, oftentimes we have pace that we can
Yeah,
use.
that's true. Right,
And
right.
swimming almost exclusively pace, right?
Hmm.
Your pace and your pace clock. Very rarely do we have good accurate measures of heart rate while swimming. and
Mhm.
there's really no other metric. I mean, we've talked about power paddles and different ways to measure power, but for most people, we're looking at just pace
Mhm.
while swimming. So that being said, John, a lot of people in the coaching world or in the training world look at heart rate, and they try and look at heart rate as the surrogate for oxygen consumption, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
That
Right.
would that be a fair assumption?
Yeah, they're correlated. So if we look at a graded exercise test, even to maximal, effort, you're going to increase the intensity very systematically over time. And as you do that, as you progress from easy exercise to maximal effort exercise, you're going to consume more and more oxygen because you're transforming chemical energy or carbohydrate fats to mechanical energy, ATP really, using oxygen. And as we also exercise harder, heart rate increases as well. And it's a very linear relationship between these two. And we can show some data later where they're very high, they are very highly correlated during a graded exercise test. They can become sort of decoupled when you're doing non-aerobic exercise. So if you're doing, intensity or strength training, I can do a strength training and my heart rate can go up, but that doesn't mean my VO2 is going up because I'm doing anaerobic. So heart rate and VO2 are highly correlated when we're doing aerobic exercise.
Yeah, agree. So how did we get to a point where we were measuring heart rate? And I don't know if you know this, but I know you teach some exercise physiology and you do
Yeah,
some.
yeah,
How did we get to a point where we determined that we know what we need, we need zones
yeah.
or we need levels? Because to me, these are really interesting, right? So we have 7-zone model, we have a 5-zone
Right,
model, and
right.
a 3-zone model
Yeah.
that are all being used in
Mhm.
aerobic athletes. Do you know? Do you know kind of how this came about? I'm
You know,
just wondering.
I don't know the history of the zones, but I know that, really we did not start measuring heart rate during exercise, especially outside exercise, until the late 70s when
Yeah,
Polar came out with their wearable heart rate monitor. And then it was really, in the 80s that this area of measuring heart rate during exercise really started to take off. Again, outside in the field as opposed to within a laboratory. EKGs have been around since the early 1900s, and putting stickers on the body that works well in the lab, but doing that outside is really difficult.
I
So
wonder
really,
what came first, if the polar system or people using EKGs in the lab came first, as far as determining zones.
I again, I don't know who came up with the first set of zones. I
Okay,
don't know that.
this is good.
But
We're
I
gonna find
guess,
this out.
yeah, no, we'll look it up and maybe we'll find it. But my point is that the heart rate monitor has only been around for about 40 years.
Yeah.
And so you're right, there's different zone models. I do believe it started with 3 zones and then it went to 5. And then, like you said, there's 7 and what have you. And so, but I think, the idea of those zones is really just to put you in a ballpark
Yeah.
of how intense your exercise is. And yeah, and then, we use these different zones as sort of ranges. Well, you could talk more about how we use the zones because I know you look at this a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't use the 7-zone model. I use a 5-zone model usually.
Right.
Um, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it really comes down to a 3-zone model. So, and I know we
Mhm.
talked about the zone models before, but really what we're talking about is we're just talking about how hard the effort is
Yep.
physiologically. When we're
Right.
talking purely about heart rate. And of course, there's power zones as well. These are somewhat correlated when we're biking, and there's run zones, which are somewhat correlated. And you mentioned RPE, so rating of perceived exertion, which can also be correlated into these zone models. But in general, we're talking about the zone models. We're talking about matching up numbers with something that's happening physiologically under the hood,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we've talked many times about LT1 and LT2. So
Mm-hmm.
lactic threshold 1, lactic threshold 2. And really, when we break these down, we start talking about, and we'll go from the bottom up. So we'll talk about zone 1 in a 5-zone model. And I know we've talked about this before, but we'll just quickly go over it. So we usually consider that like a recovery
Mm-hmm.
zone. So now I don't necessarily like that because it's still aerobic, right? We're still working aerobically. And in general, I think that oftentimes that zone one gets discounted.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, it's not important. It's just zone one. But really, we're talking about in zone one, we're talking about I think it's like, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. Is it 60% of maximum heart rate?
Zone one, I think, is a little lower than
Even
that.
lower, 50 to
50,
60%.
50 to 60, yeah.
So it's not a tremendous amount of stress on your system,
Mhm.
but ultimately it's still some stress on your system. Then we
Mhm.
get to zone two, and most people consider this, the aerobic or the
Mhm.
endurance zone. And for most triathletes, they're spending a lot of time, or they're trying to spend a lot of time, if they have time, in
Mhm.
zone two. And it's an interesting one because I think that zone two these days has a lot of there's a lot of information out there,
Yeah.
and this is the hot topic these days. Like I think
Mhm.
3 or 4 years ago it was like hit training. Now
Yeah,
it's zone two training,
that's right.
and they both, I mean, don't get me wrong, they both have their place, but this seems to be the thing that people are really pushing towards right now. And I think this year in particular, but because Pogacar from the Tour de France, he published all his training data,
Okay.
and it was just tons and tons, not just, but the
Mhm.
majority of it was tons and tons of zone two,
Yeah.
like 30-35 hours a week of zone two.
Mhm.
And they're like, well, where's the magic there?
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, the magic there is he's training aerobically for an aerobic sport.
Right, right.
Right? And we can get into kind of the why it works and why some people don't subscribe to this zone two training method if we want, but that's in general what we're talking about.
Mhm.
Then in really what we're coming up to there is kind of the point, and what the top of zone two should be our lactic threshold one.
Mhm.
So where we start to basically, what is it, accumulate
Yeah.
accumulate lactate at a little bit of a higher
It's
rate.
starting to be produced at a faster rate than you can use it. So anytime lactate's produced in the body, there's a couple of things that can happen to it. It can be buffered, and then you basically exhale carbon dioxide on excess carbon dioxide, or it could be pulled into a muscle cell
Yeah.
and used as a fuel, and then it enters the aerobic process at that point. And so right now, if we do a finger prick, you and I will both have lactate in our blood,
Yeah.
and because it never goes to zero. And so that always means that the anaerobic system is always working, as is the aerobic system always. They won't turn these on and off. But right now, we're able to either buffer that lactic acid, or more likely, we probably just pull it back into another cell and use it as a fuel. It just enters the aerobic system at that point. So we are matching our production with our use, or whichever way you want to look at it. And so it's, if we do a finger prick now, we do it in 10 minutes, it's still going to be right around one.
Yeah.
But as you said, at some point, it starts to go above that baseline. And now we're starting to produce lactic acid faster than we're starting to use it.
Yeah. But we can still tolerate it for a long time.
That's right. That's
Right.
right.
Now I look at this border between zone two and zone three truly as this is the border where you start to build more fatigue,
Mm-hmm.
like significantly more fatigue in zone three than in zone two.
Mm-hmm.
Theoretically, if you were somewhat trained, you should be able to do zone two all day long.
Yeah, zone two should be light.
Yeah.
Very easy. Zone three would be moderate.
Yeah. And so
Yep.
to me, like that's the big difference is I'm building more fatigue in zone three.
Mhm.
I'm building now, as far as my understanding of this, and the way I utilize this, zone two and zone three, as far as what we get out of them aerobically, are basically the same.
Mm-hmm.
Zone three just produces more fatigue. So like
Yeah.
I don't do a lot of work with myself in zone three.
Yeah.
I do some, especially as I'm getting ready for a race.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be able to, because I'm going to be racing mostly in zone three.
That's right. For a long 70.3 or a full.
At 70.3, I'm going to be racing
Yeah.
there. Even like an Olympic distance race, I'm probably going to be racing in the upper end of zone 3. So I do want to do sports specific as I go into the race. But like right now, I'm doing very little zone 3
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
because there's just not there's not much bang for the buck. And
right.
I'd rather be able to do another zone 2 ride tomorrow
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't build up the
Yeah.
fatigue.
It
So
helps.
zone 3, we consider the next kind of level, and that's most people call that like tempo
Yeah.
or sub threshold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And zones 1, 2, and 3 are all designed to be below what we would call the lactic acid threshold or anaerobic threshold.
Or your functional threshold power,
Yeah.
threshold speed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yes, and so and so when we look at the border between 3 and 4, when we think of the lactate model, this
Mm-hmm.
is the point where lactate exponentially goes up
Right.
to the point where if you kept going for very long, you would eventually, above level 3 or zone
Mm-hmm.
3, you would have to stop
Yep.
because you're not able to utilize that lactate or clear that lactate quick enough. And eventually what ends up happening is we get more acidity in the blood and more hydrogen ions in the blood and in muscle cells. And those eventually create a lot of pain and will make you slow down eventually.
Yes, but there's some good research that the amount of lactate in the system at that point may just be because it's not a causative factor.
Oh no, I'm not saying it's causative. I think it's the hydrogen ions
Right.
and
Mm-hmm.
the hydrogen ions create an acidic environment in the muscle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely, from my reading, I completely agree. It's not, we're measuring lactate.
Yeah, right.
It's a surrogate for something else.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So then we look at zone 4. People will call that threshold or supra threshold. So really, you have a window here of where this is, and I mean it's getting up there in heart rate. I think we're looking at over 90% ish. Or
Yeah, zone 4,
90%.
80 to 90%, because the idea is that the lactate threshold, the anaerobic threshold, and I'll use those two synonymously, even though there are some subtle differences between them. Yeah, zone 4 is 80 to 90% on my read here.
But it's getting quite significant to hold, let's say, 80 to 90% of your maximum heart rate
Yeah, thanks. I should have added that in.
for any given time is hard, right? But
Yeah.
this is where you see people doing training where they're doing like over unders, or
Mhm.
they're doing like a certain amount of time at this level. So
Yeah.
most people will try and hit at the low end of zone 4,
Mhm.
because the theory is you get the same benefit at the low end of zone 4 as you do at the high end of zone 4.
Yeah.
So we see models of like doing threshold work where it's like 95% of your FDP,
Yeah.
to 95% to like 100% of FDP.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I personally do these kind of workouts, and I want to be at 95% rather than
Yeah.
100.
Right. Right.
If you think about your FTP is, I don't know, let's say it's 200 watts,
Mhm.
and you've done a lot of this, you're way better off to be at 190
Yeah.
than you are 200.
Mhm. Mhm.
And with this training, it's almost always better to be a little bit lower than a little bit higher. And then we get to the next zone. So above that is zone 5. We call this anaerobic. In the 7 zone model, it gets broken down into VO2 max. I don't really like using VO2 max as like the thing here, because VO2 max basically says, that's the maximum amount of oxygen you can possibly use, but
Mhm.
that can't be if there's a window.
Yeah. Right.
So I like kind of anaerobic, even though this is still aerobic.
Yeah. Right.
Right? It's a tricky one, and the truth is, in my experience, especially dealing with long course athletes or aerobic athletes, I think we need very, very, very little of this, unless you're testing somebody and you determine that this is a limiter for them. Right?
Mhm. Mhm.
If you test somebody and everything else looks great, but their VO2 max is low from what you think it should be, then maybe you can address this.
Mhm.
And you tend to address this with like 2 or 3 minute efforts, maybe you can build up to like 4 or 5 minute efforts
Mhm.
of all out, where you want to max your heart rate. Like you literally want
Mhm.
to get to the highest heart rate you can get to for that amount of time.
Yeah, and I think what the benefit for a lot of people is to experience these intensities, because the tendency, and I know you're going to get into this a little bit more, is the tendency is to sort of train in that middle ground, which is not not a great place to be. But to get up to some of these higher intensities, you got to teach your body how to manage that and how to achieve it as well. And so I think there's some value in it, but you've got to balance the consistency of exercise with some of these higher intensity sessions.
And I think that you're right with experiencing them, especially zone 4,
Hmm.
right? Experiencing what threshold feels like,
Right.
right? And understanding that most people, their true threshold, they can't hold for an hour,
Hmm.
right? So if you have somebody that, for example, that's going to be racing a 70.3 and they want to do a 2.5 hour bike split,
Yeah.
you can't say, you're going to go at threshold. Now, it might feel like you're at your threshold,
Hmm.
right? But you should be at your 2.5 hour threshold, not your
Yeah.
1 hour threshold.
Yeah.
And so, but knowing that, and so I love what you said about experiencing it, because a lot of people that I've talked to and read about it, they blow up on the bike because they go too far into threshold,
Right. Right.
too high in zone 3, and they dip into zone 4 for extended periods of time,
Hmm.
not recognizing it.
Hmm.
And they get in the heat of the battle, right?
Yeah.
People are passing them, they're getting upset, or they had a bad swim and they're trying to make up time. We've talked
Hmm.
a lot about these things in
Yeah.
triathlon before.
Yeah.
And if you truly know your body and know what zone 4 feels like and what zone 3 feels like, you
Hmm.
can sometimes temper yourself.
Yeah. No, and I think that's where that perception of exercise becomes so important. And that's where I tend to lean more in that world of using perception. But it is you've got to know what it feels like, know what to avoid at times, and know when to reach it as well.
But you lose perception when you're racing sometimes.
You can. That's why. That's right. That's why it's nice to double
Is it,
check and
is it
see
the
where the heart is at the same time.
yeah, it's the amygdala in the brain, right? That gets stimulated with competition and fear,
Yeah.
and so there's places in our brain that kind of turn off
Hmm.
sometimes when
Yeah.
we lose logic.
Hmm.
And when you lose logic, sometimes it doesn't matter, right? Like, and because how many times do we talk to people and they're like, oh man, I would have had a better run if I didn't overbike.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
what was your plan? Well, my plan
Yeah.
was this. Well, what did you do? Well, I did over the plan. Well, why? Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
And
Right.
they literally don't know
Yeah.
why, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's the things we talk about, like having a poor swim or having a great swim,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? And like, okay, today's my day. We've talked about that
Hmm.
before. Or yeah, someone passes them that they feel shouldn't be passing them.
Right.
And well, I got to go harder, even though their heart rate monitor is telling them not to, or their power zones are telling them not to.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
Yeah. No, I love that, and that the race tactics obviously come into play here. I got to catch up on a couple of comments here. Bob, we're going to get to your comment on different sets of heart rate zones for cycling and running, and we'll talk about that. And then Luigi puts a comment here, which is great. The highest VO2 max doesn't mean the person will win a race. And I think that's great.
yeah.
We're not talking predicting performance at all. And Luigi's spot on is just having a high VO2 max doesn't mean you're even going to be a great endurance athlete. It just means you have a high VO2 max. So it is interesting.
But I would contend that you'd be a lot better off with a high VO2 max if your threshold is close to it,
Hmm.
right? So that's the thing that oftentimes is missed. So like someone comes and they have a VO2 of 60, which is great,
Yeah.
but their threshold is at 40.
Oh, we see this in elite runners is that you may have a great 800 runner, you may have a great miler, a great marathoner, but they aren't the same people. And it all is a matter of how close to their VO2 max they can sustain.
Yep. Yep.
No, I
And,
love it. All right.
if
So
we look at these elite triathletes and elite runners, oftentimes like the long distance runners are at 85,
yeah,
90%
right,
of
right.
VO2 max at threshold.
That's right.
And that's a very special thing that takes a lot of work and training. So Luigi's 100% right.
Yep. No, that's great. Love it. And where the threshold is very trainable.
Yeah.
Very trainable. What's interesting is VO2 max by itself is not necessarily very trainable. In fact, if we take a group of, especially triathletes right now that are watching this, who are probably already pretty fit, and we measure their VO2 max now, and we measured it again in 12 weeks, maybe a little bit of difference. But where the threshold occurs in that range up to VO2 max, that can be pushed closer to VO2 max, and that's really what your training program is really focusing on, is to move that higher and higher in terms of intensity.
Well, I think that VO2 max is trainable, John, but it just takes so much, and it takes so much concerted effort that you have to give up aerobic training, or not, sorry, endurance training to do it.
Hmm.
So, where you're doing like VO2 blocks for like 3 or 4 weeks straight,
Hmm.
where you're going 3 times a week, or probably 3 times a week of specific VO2 training.
Hmm.
And let's say you do that for 3 or 4 weeks, there's research that shows we can increase your VO2 max,
Hmm.
but is it going to make you a better triathlete? And
Right.
some people it will. If that's the limiter for them, right?
Well,
Then I think that's something we ultimately can train. But for most, you're right. Most of the triathletes that have been training for a long period of time already have slowly built up their
hmm.
max
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think there's a distinction between taking a trained athlete
Yeah,
and looking for changes in VO2 max versus someone who's coming off a couch. And a lot of the research studies that show big changes in VO2 max are the people where their subjects are very unfit to begin with.
yeah.
But if you take you and we do your VO2 max now and you go through your training program, I doubt it will change much at all.
Well,
But you may become more fit.
I wouldn't do 3 weeks of that, because that would be horrible.
Yeah. I love it. That's great. Um,
Maybe we should. It's the off season. Just I'll say,
yeah,
for the next 3 weeks, I'm going to do, because we'll have to pre-test and then
yeah,
do 3 weeks. It's only 9 sessions,
yeah, yeah,
and see if I could raise my VO2 max. I bet I could a little,
yeah.
but what would I give up?
Right. Well, okay. So now this leads to a whole nother line of thought, is that if and this is not your situation, a lot of times when we do a VO2 max test, we actually need to give people a chance to experience that test,
Yeah,
because the next time they come back and do it, it may just be that they're more experienced, they know what to expect,
yeah.
as opposed to starting off as novice, which is not you. You've done several of these.
I've done too many.
Yeah,
I
so
don't know if
that's
I ever want to do another one.
yeah, right, right, right. No, yeah, no, that's great. All right, so do you want to go through some data?
Well, let's go through Bob's question really quick, because
Yeah, yeah,
it's really important.
okay.
So, depending on who you ask and where you read, um, there are different zones for different sports. And so we actually were reviewing an article from USA Triathlon today that we're going to talk about, or we're talking about now. And they put down the number, in general, and this was from several high level coaches, that the run was 10 beats in general higher than the cycle, and 15 beats higher than the swim at any
Mhm.
given point.
Right.
So if you're at zone 2, you're 130 for the run, you're 120 on the bike,
Mhm.
you're 115 on the swim. So that's a kind of a rule of thumb. But I think what we can do nowadays, we can actually test it.
Mhm.
Right? We could actually do field testing and come up with you know some numbers, but
Mhm.
most people use calculators, and that's what we're gonna talk about a little bit more today, is how to calculate your zones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I love that. And yeah, it's still VO2 and heart rate are still correlated in these different sports, but the max level that you can reach in each of these sports tends to be a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, and I guess we could talk about why really quickly
Mhm.
as well. So why does running produce a higher heart rate than cycling, John?
Well, that's a good question. And the first level of answer I would give is you would tend to use more muscle in a weight-bearing exercise like running. You're actually using lower extremity and upper extremity quite a bit versus cycling versus swimming. That's the general answer. And we've brought this up in previous episodes, but if you take a runner
Yeah.
and run them on the treadmill and then put them on the cycle. That's going to be different than if you take a cyclist and test them on the cycle and test them on the treadmill, or if you take a swimmer and do swimming VO2 max versus either the other. So there is an experience level with the sport that comes into play
But
here. So the
if we go
why
back,
is
if
Yeah.
we do a well-rounded triathlete though, that's been training all three sports for a significant amount of time,
Hmm.
I think that that 10-15 model sort of works,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
I,
And obviously there's always
I,
individual variability.
yeah. Yeah. No, it's probably, a lot of these, even the zones, I mean, we're just trying to get close to something. And so, yeah, if you're looking at heart rate during cycling, your heart rate's likely going to be lower than running. If you're looking at heart rate during swimming, it's likely going to be lower than running, likely. But it's a range, and we're getting some ideas across that way.
I love the fact that you said range, and I want to reiterate this one more time, that if your zone, let's say zone 2 again, the
Hmm.
top of zone 2 is 140 and the bottom's 132.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask you, John, as just an athlete, if you knew everything else was equal, where would you want to train?
If it wouldn't matter. I mean, if I'm going in that zone, I mean, where I'd rather train,
Yeah, where
most
would you
likely,
rather train?
probably easier.
Right. And this is such a, and why I want to talk about this is such a crazy thing in life. We almost always want the most bang for our buck.
Well, I actually think it's because we're inherently lazy.
No, I think that we're inherently we're trying to, yeah, to be the most efficient humans possible.
That's right.
Right? So that being said, and we've talked about this already, why do many athletes want to be at the top of their zones when they train?
Well, and Bob already beat us to this one. He put in quotes, more is better, right? And that's the mindset often of a triathlete as well. If I can do just a little bit more, that's got to
Exactly.
be better. And if I do a little bit more, that's got to be better. And that's a trap that you can fall into. So
It's the
yeah.
trap. Like
Oh,
I've really been working on this off season on my long, slow stuff is to go in the bottom of zone 2.
yeah.
It's so much more enjoyable.
Right. Right.
It really is, and it's easier.
Hmm.
It's easier. I get off of a 3-hour bike ride. I'm not devastated. If
No,
I'm
that's
at
right.
the top of zone 2, then I'm usually bumping into zone 3 every now and then.
Yep.
I I fatigue more. Like it's a physical fatigue, it's a
Yep.
mental fatigue.
Yeah.
And if I know I'm getting basically the same adaptations and
Yeah.
same
Right.
signaling, I want to be in the lower end.
Yeah. Yeah, I just did I did a second indoor ride today, and my second one, I just set that wattage at such an easy level because that's all I wanted out of that was really just the pedaling and, coordination and just a real easy, low intense ride.
You were still getting aerobic training.
Yeah, right, right.
Yeah,
And that's the
I know
more that's better. Yeah.
I know there's a lot of coaches that will do this with their aerobic training or their zone 1, 2 rides, is they'll tell people,
Hmm.
I want you to turn your screen off on your computer and
Mm-hmm.
just ride, just have fun.
Yeah, right, right.
Just just have fun.
Hmm.
And don't race people up hills.
Yeah.
Just have conversation if you're with somebody else.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and so Bob adds in here, I made a huge improvement to my endurance when incorporating hiking into my workouts. And we've talked about the value of that because it's a lower heart rate, he says, and yeah, you're able to still get an aerobic workout and increase that volume of time of exercise, which is probably really good.
I did a 3-hour hike today, and
Hmm.
for that very reason.
Yeah, yeah.
And what I'm doing with my hiking, I think we talked about last week, is I'm walking the way up and
Hmm.
jogging the way down. Not
Yeah.
hard,
Hmm.
just trying to keep my heart rate a little bit more elevated. Because if I walk the way down, I think I'm even outside of zone
Yeah.
zone, right?
Hmm.
Um, but I think Bob is spot on. Like 3 hours on my feet,
Yeah. Yeah.
at a heart rate of 105,
Yeah.
110
Hmm.
is a significant amount of time. I can't run for 3 hours.
Hmm. Right.
I can't. Like
Hmm.
maybe one day I'm
Hmm.
able to, but
Right now you can't, but yeah,
now I can't. But I
yeah,
can definitely walk. And
yeah,
even when I finish, I'm like, I could go longer.
yeah, yeah.
I could have went longer. It was getting dark, cold, and Cosmo was tired, so we came
There
back.
you go. You wore Cosmo out.
I wore
And-
him out. He's literally like, look, he's right here. He's looking like he's comatose right now.
I love it. Okay, do you want to share your spreadsheet? And we should
Yep.
say I posted a link in the comments.
Okay.
And if anyone's listening and goes to that link, teamusa.org, how to calculate your heart rate zones, I think is what it says. And there is a link in that article to this spreadsheet that you can download and use.
Okay, is it filling
Yep,
your?
that looks good. All
Okay,
right. And if you
so
got
this is,
if you got the audio only version of this podcast, just know that we're looking at a spreadsheet that has some data in there for TED in terms of age, gender, and resting heart rate, and then the zones are calculated.
yeah. And so this was produced by, it says USAT level 1 certified coach Kenneth E. Johnson. And I mean, but the website was created by that, but these methods are pretty well known methods in exercise physiology for determining zones. So the Carbonin, the Tanaka, and the Hunt study, these are all different methods that people will in general use. And basically you can calculate these off of your sex, which we have here, right? Age and resting heart rate. So I take my resting heart rate for the last 3 days. So it's 41, 39, and 40. And for those listening in, I'm 50.
Mm-hmm.
And we were able to, you can get these numbers. Now, it's interesting if I change this to when I was 40, everything changes, right?
Yep.
So one thing that I think is interesting, John, is that age does play a role.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that as we age, our heart rate slows down. Basically for any zone.
Oh, totally. If we look at age and we look at heart rate max, we see a linear decline in heart rate max over age. Oddly enough, there's actually no explanation for it. There's some ideas behind why it is, but as we get older, our max heart rate just gets lower.
The one thing that I've came across in some of the reading as we we're getting ready for this is that it's actually something that if you continue to push to those upper limits, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't decline as much.
Mm.
So if we do a little bit of that zone 5
Yeah.
training, if you never did anything that pushes the limit, which makes sense, right? If you're not stressing the system, it's not going to react.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that doing sports does help with this, and doing things like running 5Ks and doing 1 mile repeats every now and then. You know, we're getting close to the top is good. You know, I think we talked about it before, like I do Zwift racing. And when I do Zwift racing, if I'm in a really competitive league or a really competitive race, that's when I hit my highest heart rates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think this week in my race, I hit a 177 heart rate. And that's, and, you know, of course, like Training Peaks comes up, oh, that's your highest heart rate of the year. And I'm like, yeah, that was, well, it's only week 2 of the year. But it still was about the same as my highest last year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, but you have to stress that. If I, you know, if all year long I never went above 155, I probably would lose a little bit more.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so let's talk through this.
No, go ahead. You want to talk about what's in this spreadsheet?
Yeah. So actually, I'm going to ask you, John, as far as in the exercise physiology world, is there one method over another that you think is more widely acceptable?
A great question, and no. The long answer is each of these techniques listed here, we've got 3 of them, are all looking at different data sets, and they're fitting the data, you know, based upon the data. They're fitting the data with the line of best fit based upon which data they have. And so they all have a little bit different. And you can find other equations. There's more equations outside of these 3. You know, we did an equation for, you know, heart rate zones, heart rate really, for running in the water. And we were able to come up with an equation much like this for when you are in the water versus on land. And you can do these types of equations for different populations. You know, maybe even if you're in cardiac rehab and you have different situations with meds and what have you, you can do something even different than these equations.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing I wanted to talk about in these is there's a lot of variability.
Yeah.
And I'm really most interested in zone 2, where zone 2 is, and where the upper limit of zone 3 is. Like those are the 2 things that I'm mostly interested in.
Yeah.
If we look at zone 2, and we'll specifically talk about, I want to talk about cycling, because that's where I tend to use, I don't know, actually I use it in both, but I tend to use it mostly because I see it all the time when it's all on my bike computer or I'm Zwifting and I see it. So zone 2 for me, what I've been thinking my zone 2 is, and this is to me kind of interesting, is like 130, 131, 132. That's kind of where I feel like I lose that
Mhm.
ability to talk,
Right.
have a conversation. I can't nose breathe. My RPE is a little bit higher, but on this one, it's interesting. So the upper end of zone 2 for the Kavornan for me was 128,
Yeah.
Haka was 120, and the Hunt was 124.
Hmm.
And so, okay, this is really interesting for me because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the average of those three.
Hmm.
I'm going to say it's 124, and when I do my long ride tomorrow, I'm putting it at 124 at the most. Like that's
Hmm.
gonna be my new maximum, and just see how that feels.
Yep.
I'm not going to live or die by it, but I think it's interesting how much variability
Yeah.
there is.
Well,
Um,
and these are equations and we're predicting and
exactly.
and so really these equations are anywhere from probably plus or minus 5 beats per minute to plus or minus 10 beats per minute in terms of the range. So you're talking about a 20 beat range of where people will vary in here. So that's
So
why
what I'm
you're trying to get close enough in these.
and why I like having three of them and averaging it.
Hmm.
Now I have three different methods, which are three different populations, and in my mind, having more data
Yeah.
is probably better.
So when you race a 70.3 when you're running, what's
Uh-huh.
your heart rate typically? What's that ends up being?
Oh, that's a good question. Right around 150.
Okay, so 150. I don't know if it's easy for you. Can you highlight the running ranges where it's 150? So that'd be zone 4 in the first one.
For
Oh,
zone
four
four,
there as
zone four.
well, and four there as well. All right, that's good. That's consistent.
Yeah,
So,
but I should be at the yeah, because I try and be at 0.85, and these are
hmm,
in zone 4, and this is 0.81 to zero
yeah,
point 0.9. So I'm right in there.
yeah, yeah.
Now, at the end of a race, as we have cardiac drift, and it does drift up.
Hmm.
I'll be
Hmm.
155
Yeah.
ish, and when I ride in 70.3, I tend to be high 140s,
Okay.
maybe 150,
Hmm.
high 140s, 150s, and so that is interesting because that's putting me even higher on this.
Hmm.
Interesting.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, my Ironman pace, I'm around the 125-ish.
Well, John,
And
let's share yours.
yeah, well, just put in age
Yeah.
59 there, and my resting heart rate is about where yours is. It's about 40. So
Okay, perfect. So what were you saying? Your Ironman?
I'd be right around 125. And so that's zone 1 in that first one,
Yeah,
zone 2 in the second one, and zone 2 in the third one.
which is good for an Ironman.
Yeah. Yeah. And
For
then
an
for
Ironman run, that's where I'd like to be, but I'm probably going to be higher because by the time I get there, I'm dehydrated and caffeined up and
yeah, yeah. And then for a sprint, I'm around high 140s. So that looks like zone 4
zone four,
for each of
zone
them.
four, and
Yeah.
zone four, which is
Yep.
perfect.
Yep.
Because the truth is that you shouldn't be in zone 5 for anything that's an
No,
hour.
that's right. Zone 5 is you're close to being done.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, all right.
So
So
anyways, I think it's kind of fun to look at these calculators and like you said, these are just calculations, and there are other ways to calculate it. I mean, obviously, this would be way better if we could have you in a lab and measure gas at the same time and dial these things in. But I think this is a good place to start.
yeah. Well,
Uh,
and we also see one of our local pro athletes. He's got a lactate analyzer and he's doing some finger pricks while training, and he's adding that into the menu of trying to understand these zones and what he can tolerate. So that's really cool to see.
so there's also this age-based calculations, and I'm not too familiar with these. This is the Tanaka and the Hunt. I think it's off of yours still though. So let's change it back to mine. So it's saying my max heart rate is 173 or 179. So it's interesting. I did 177 the other night. So I know and that was on the bike.
Hmm.
So I know that I'm above 173. Um, the other thing that's interesting for me, John, and I'm going to throw this out there, because there's anomalies, right? Like I can get a higher heart rate on the bike than I can running,
Right.
but I think it's mostly because I just can't turn my legs over fast
Ah,
enough.
yeah, right, right. But that goes back to, if we look at swimmers running or cyclists, right? I mean, and in your case, you're able to respond in a particular way. And this is what I think it's a really great point is, this is where it's really valuable to be looking at your heart rate post hoc or after you're done with your exercise or going back in your data sets and look at your races and look at what your heart rate was for a particular sprint distance or Olympic or half or full and start looking and seeing what those numbers are and then seeing, reverse engineer those zones that way as well.
No, I completely agree. And this is something that I actually spend a lot of time looking at, um, post run, post exercise. But mostly I look at it like when I do a race,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we're just talking about where are you in a 70.3 or where am I in a 5K?
Yeah.
For me in a 5K, I want to be zone 5 for a
Yeah.
significant amount of it if
Yeah.
I can, right? And so I've done a few 5Ks recently, and I was just around. So if we look at this, I was just around the 170, and at the end of the race, like when I really pushed during the last couple
Mm-hmm.
hundred yards, 172,
Mm-hmm.
173,
Yeah.
and that's getting pretty dang close to where these upper limits are.
Yeah. And it's a good check too, because these are based upon age prediction of heart rate max, is that if you can never get close to that heart rate max, it's probably not the right number because that age prediction is again plus or minus 10 beats per minute. So really a 20 beat swing between low and high.
Well, and we know this is not right. I guess that's
Mm-hmm.
the thing, because I just did it on Tuesday night. I had a 177 on the bike, and the upper limit is basically 100%. So
Yeah.
the highest they have here on cycling is 169 on the hunt method.
Yeah.
I know that I can go higher than that.
Yeah.
So,
And Bob adds in here, and this is an excellent point. He says it's hard for me to use these zones because my heart rate is kept low with medication. And that is so important to know if you are on medication that influences the heart rate that you really got to be careful. And these zones will have less meaning if you're on medicine that influences your heart rate.
and I'll throw out, even if you're using like an ergogenic aid like caffeine or
Yeah,
ginseng,
yeah.
pre-workout or
Stimulant. Yeah.
stimulant of some kind, you'd throw this out. It,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's probably they're probably not very valid.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop sharing this. So I think this is going to be good for for the people that are listening to just mess around with this,
Yeah.
and but also have it in mind. Like I was saying, well, maybe I should lower my bike power that I'm or bike heart rate I'm riding at. But then I'm like, well, but they think my maximum heart rate is 169,
Right.
so maybe not, right?
Yeah. Right. Right.
But so understanding these are not, these are predictions.
Yeah.
They're not
That's
everything.
right. All right, so let me throw up some more data here, and I'll throw up some data that we collected a couple of years ago. I think it was now, maybe 3 years ago. My goodness, where we did the graded exercise test on the bike, and we used different protocols. And you and I were just messing around with some different ways of doing that. And so I wanted to show this plot because this is rate of oxygen consumption and over time, and we have rate of oxygen consumption in red. We've got power in blue, and my heart rate is there somewhere. That's uh, well, they're closely related to.
It's so tight we can't see.
Yeah, I can't distinguish them. But if I go to another plot here, where I'm looking, what I did here is I plotted heart rate on the y-axis and VO2 on the x-axis, and look at how closely those are tied to each other. It's a correlation of 0.97, which is really close, which means for every increase in VO2, it's going to have a similar increase in heart rate, relatively speaking. And so that's where this value of measuring heart rate, because I can measure heart rate so easily out in the field, I can't measure VO2 out in the field. But this VO2 is telling me about the system that's transforming chemical energy to ATP, which allows muscles to contract and generate a force.
Well, and I love the fact you showed this because there are many people out there when you do some reading in this area that think that heart rate is dead.
Hmm.
Oh, we have power. We've, especially on cycling.
Yeah.
This correlation is so strong that to think that heart rate is not a valuable tool, I
Hmm.
think is, I don't know, maybe it's clickbait.
Yeah, right, right.
I mean, oh, read this article because I think heart rate is dead. I mean, this tells you that it is a very good metric.
Yeah. And I somewhere, I don't know if I don't know why I don't have it here. Heart rate and power are very related. Again, we're talking about um, graded exercise. We're not talking about strength training. Strength training totally different because you can have an increase in heart rate. That does not mean that your rate of oxygen consumption's increasing. Strength training is all about, for the most part, stressing the anaerobic system. That doesn't mean the heart doesn't stop beating. It actually is stimulated to beat as well. So totally different when we start doing these, rolling intensities versus what we're talking about, a sustained exercise.
So I know what I want to do next in the lab.
What's that?
We should do a Zwift race
Yeah,
up to the bullet cart because we always do these graded exercise tests,
yeah,
right?
yeah, right,
What happens when in the first 3 minutes of a Zwift race, I got to make a climb?
right,
It's going to separate the pack, and if I don't make that front group,
right.
right, I'm going to go basically from just warmed up to maximum effort in 3 minutes. And then I'm going to have a little recovery, and then I'm going to go again, have a little recovery.
Yep.
I think that would be a pretty cool thing to do. I don't know if I've ever seen somebody do
Yeah.
an indoor bike race and collect the data.
No, I think that would be great and that would be fun. And what we're actually getting into here now is what we would call energetic cost. Even though most of the time we just use VO2 to calculate energetic cost, it doesn't tell the whole story in a situation that you're talking about. And in that situation, we have to account for the anaerobic contribution of ATP. And we can do that. We can actually estimate that off of the VCO2. And so, some of our more recent studies, we've gotten a number of reviewers to say, hey, don't just include energetic cost using VO2, use energetic cost using VO2 and VCO2. So we've moved the dial in that way as well. So a lot of the research is built on VO2, but what you're speaking to in terms of the anaerobic system, which would be the other component of respiratory, is the VCO2, the amount of carbon dioxide you're exhaling. That we can measure in the lab, and we can actually do a calculation of calories of that way as well.
I think it's gonna be fun.
Yeah, yeah.
Listening, we're gonna have to get that set up.
We got the bikes, we got the trainers, we got the
Everything we
VO2
need.
system. We can do some more finger pricks.
Yep. Oh man, I actually think it'd be really interesting, like a half hour, 40-minute race
Yeah,
where
yeah,
you're having these surges and
yeah,
if you think about it, like a Zwift race or an indoor race is not like an outdoor race.
right, right.
They tend to be very short, like 30,
Mhm,
40 minutes, and very stochastic in
mhm.
nature. Not always, but I think that'd be really interesting to
Yeah.
do. I'm going to schedule this.
No, I love the field type of work because the lab work is important to establish some relationships because you control a lot of things. And that's the whole idea behind lab work is you're controlling things. But in the real world, you got a lot of uncontrolled things. And so it's neat to look at those relationships, during a race as well.
And I think an indoor race is so unique, right?
Yeah,
Because it's typically in a lab,
yeah, yeah.
right? The
Hmm.
external world is just a computer screen I'm looking at.
Right, right.
No, I think that's going to be put that on the bucket list of things to do. And
Yeah, yeah,
we'll talk about this
yeah.
on the
And
podcast.
it'd be actually so easy. You would just plot that same VO2 versus heart rate for a graded exercise test versus a Swift race.
Yeah,
And your hypothesis would be that those data points all line up on the same line.
they should, right?
They should. That's the idea. But what
But they
you're
might
what
not.
you're suspecting is that they may not. And so that's where it'd be cool. Yeah.
And the interesting thing is when we look at like these races I do in the Zwift Racing League, is oftentimes it'll be like multiple loops of a
Yeah.
course, and you have multiple climbs.
Right.
They're like 3, 5 minutes each.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's interesting, the people that do well in the first climb don't always do well in the second climb.
Mm-hmm.
If everything plots
Yeah.
properly, they should,
Mm-hmm.
right? But
Yeah.
their heart rates are high, but their power output is not on the
Mm-hmm.
second
Mm-hmm.
climb.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that ultimately is fitness, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But like, how does that come, it wouldn't be predicted in the lab,
Yeah,
basically.
right, right, right. Well, then that's because this intensity thing does influence how fast the heart. I mean, there's a hormonal thing that happens here as well, and then the micro recoveries that you have going on. That yeah, I mean, when we stop exercising, our heart rate still stays elevated,
Right.
and so it's
But the fitter
elevated.
you are, the more it recovers.
That's right. It's
It recovers.
right.
No, it's something that definitely, like when I'm racing on Zwift, I'm paying attention to, like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
what's the least I can pedal right now in the downhill or
Yeah,
in the draft, like trying to recover as much as I can. And I know if I recover more because I'm
mm-hmm.
fitter, the
Yeah,
next effort is going to be better.
right, right.
Okay,
Love it.
I think we're gonna, and then the thing is, we could record the whole thing. We could
Yeah,
record the video of the Zwift at the same
yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah.
It's gonna be good. Okay, this is a project for
All
us.
right, we got a project and maybe we can find a student to do his or her thesis on it or dissertation. So that's
I
awesome.
like, I like this a lot. Okay, see how good this podcast is? We just keep coming up with better things to do in the
Yeah,
lab.
that's awesome. Hey, this was fun.
Yeah, this was fun. I hope you all got something out of it. I know I did.
Yeah,
Uh, it's gonna. We'll see when I'm riding tomorrow. What
yeah,
what I end up
right,
doing now.
right,
I don't. I'm thinking maybe I'm more confused.
right. I love it. All right, hey, thanks everyone. Thanks for all the comments. That was helpful and really interesting. Love the insight.
Yeah. All right. Well, John, have a great weekend. Long weekend, so a little
Yeah,
extra training.
yeah, long weekend. Yeah, we'll just get more exercise in,
All right.
more
Awesome.
coffee too.
More coffee. All right. Well, have a good weekend.
Okay, thanks. You too.